The convent of Santa Margherita had stood in the Umbrian hills for nearly 500 years, its stones weathered by rain and time. When Elena inherited the crumbling property from an aunt she barely remembered, she thought it would be a burden. Empty rooms, leaking roof, debts she could not afford. Her brother Marco arrived from Rome with skepticism etched across his face. Yet among the aunt's papers they found something that changed everything. A sketch in faded ink showing a tunnel beneath the convent, marked with a single Latin phrase, Veritas in abysso, truth in the abyss. The locals in the village below warned them to let the place sleep. The convent held secrets, they said. Priests had sealed certain rooms centuries ago. Some whispered that the tunnel led somewhere that the church preferred forgotten. Elena dismissed it as folklore, the kind of talk that kept tourists away. But Marco, a historian by training, felt the pull of the mystery. If the tunnel was real, what had warranted such deliberate concealment? The first time they descended into the earth, neither expected what waited in the darkness below. Chapter 1. The Inheritance. Elena stood in the courtyard as afternoon light faded behind the convent's bell tower. The structure loomed above her, its facade a patchwork of honey-colored stone and dark patches where moisture had claimed the surface. 23 years had passed since she last visited, a childhood summer when her aunt still smiled easily. Now the woman was gone, and Elena held the deed to something she did not want. Marco emerged from the cloister, his footsteps echoing across the worn tiles. His jacket was dusty from exploring the upper floors, and his expression carried the weight of disappointing calculations. "The roof alone will cost 50,000 euros, he said, shaking his head. And the western wall is leaning. Structural damage, probably dating back 15 years at minimum. We should sell to the renovation company. They'll turn it into a hotel, and we walk away clean, debt-free even with a small profit." Elena did not answer immediately. Instead, she knelt beside a stone bench in the courtyard, its surface worn smooth by centuries of use. The bench bore faint Latin inscriptions, barely readable. She withdrew the sketch from her satchel with careful movements. The paper was brittle, the lines drawn in what looked like charcoal mixed with something darker, perhaps ash. The tunnel was rendered in precise detail, a descent from somewhere beneath the convent's east wing, a long passage marked with intervals, then a chamber with a series of symbols that seemed to follow a deliberate pattern. "Where did you find that?" Marco's voice shifted, losing its practical tone. He came closer, his skepticism momentarily suspended by curiosity. "In Aunt's desk, under the ledgers, wrapped in cloth, in a compartment I almost missed." Elena's fingers traced the edge of the paper, careful not to tear it further. "There's a note on the back. She wrote it, I think, her handwriting anyway." She turned the paper over. In wavering handwriting, unsteady with age or emotion, their aunt had written, "If you ever find yourself here, you should know. This place holds more than prayers." And Marco took the sketch, studying it like an archaeologist examining a fragment of pottery. He held it up to the dying sunlight, examining the watermarks, the ink's consistency. "This could be anything," he said, but his tone suggested he did not believe his own words. A fantasy, someone's daydream, sketched during a boring afternoon. A game, perhaps. Old people do strange things when they're lonely. "Then why hide it?" Elena rose to her feet, brushing dust from her jeans. "Why wrap it in cloth? Why leave it for us specifically?" Aunt Em wasn't the sort to leave games behind for her heirs to puzzle out. She was practical, almost ruthlessly so. "Because it was hers," Marco countered, but he was already studying the map again, mentally navigating its passages. "Because privacy matters, even in the things we don't understand." Boom. But Elena saw something else in his eyes, the same hunger she had glimpsed in photographs from his university years, before he chose a safe career cataloguing other people's discoveries. This sketch was calling to something he thought he had buried, some part of himself that had wanted to be an explorer rather than an archivist. "The East Wing," Elena said. "The sketch shows access from the East Wing. Look at the angle of descent, the reference points. That's definitely beneath the East Wing. Come and look." The East Wing was less damaged than the north side, but far from pristine. A corridor ran the length of the building, lined with heavy wooden doors, most of them locked with iron bolts that had rusted to the color of dried blood. At the far end, they found a room that had been sealed, chains wrapped around the door handle, 2 of them, and a padlock so rusted it crumbled at the gentlest touch, fragmenting into orange powder. Inside was a storage chamber, lined with stone shelves. Water had damaged whatever had once rested there, books perhaps, or documents, leaving only scattered fragments of leather and pulp that had returned to nature. But the floor was what made them both stop. Flagstones arranged in a careful pattern, geometric and deliberate. One corner was slightly raised, as if designed to be discovered. When Marco pressed down on it, the stone shifted with surprising ease, revealing a depression beneath. He knelt and directed his phone's flashlight downward. Stone stairs descended into darkness, each step worn smooth by centuries of passage. "Stone stairs," he whispered. "Going down, going deep." Eleanor's breath caught. Their aunt had known. She had stood in this very room perhaps decades ago and had decided to leave them a map. A key hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment, the right loss to be discovered. Chapter 2. The Descent. They returned at dawn with equipment they assembled from the convent storage areas and a trip to the village hardware store. Ropes, headlamps with extra batteries, a portable speaker playing classical music. Marco's joke to keep their spirits up, though it died in the darkness almost immediately. The music echoed strangely in the descending tunnel, turning Debussy into something alien and disconcerting. The stairs descended steeply, each step worn smooth by centuries of use. The walls wept moisture, rivulets of water catching their headlamp beams and glinting like tears. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of earth and something else. Old stone, perhaps, or minerals leached from the walls by endless seepage. Elena could taste the minerals on her tongue, a faint metallic tang. 40 steps down, 50. Elena counted them compulsively, calling out the numbers to Marco, a way to anchor herself to something measurable in the overwhelming darkness. Her voice sounded thin, diminished. The stone seemed to swallow sound. At 63 steps, the tunnel opened into a passage barely wide enough for 2 people side by side. Marco's headlamp illuminated limestone walls, carved with deliberate precision. Not natural caverns, then. Someone had excavated this deliberately, guided by intention and architecture, not accident. The marks of tools were still visible in places, chisel strikes that had become one with the stone centuries ago. "Renaissance," Marco breathed, his voice reverent. "The technique, the spacing, this is Renaissance work, 15th or early 16th century. Look at how the arches support the ceiling. This is masterwork. Someone hired the best engineers of the age to build this." The passage extended deeper into the earth. Along one wall they noticed marks, crosses carved into the stone at regular intervals, each one slightly different from the last. Some bore additional symbols beneath them, crescents, stars, geometric patterns that seemed to follow a mathematical progression. Marco photographed each one obsessively, his hands shaking slightly as he worked, adjusting angles and lighting. "Documentation," Elena said. "They're documenting something. Each symbol is different. Look, this one has a date next to it, 1523, and this one 1528. They're marking time. They're creating a chronology in stone." Of what? Marco wondered aloud, but his eyes had already moved to the next symbol, hungry for answers. After what felt like an hour of walking, though Eleanor's watch showed only 37 minutes, the passage opened into a chamber. It was small, perhaps 15 meters across, with a ceiling that rose into shadow beyond their headlamp's reach. The floor was dry here, protected by the convent's weight above, tons of stone that had sheltered this space from the world's intrusions. A perfect equilibrium maintained for 500 years. And in the center, built into the stone itself, was a chest. It was carved from a single block of limestone, easily 3 meters in length, its edges smooth with age and careful maintenance. Someone had polished these surfaces repeatedly over centuries, keeping them pristine. Symbols covered its surface, not crosses now, but intricate Latin inscriptions, mathematical notations, and geometric patterns that seemed to repeat and evolve across the stone, like a philosophical argument rendered in rock. Marco approached it slowly, reverently, as if it might vanish if he moved too quickly. Elena followed a step behind, breathing shallowly. The air in the chamber was still, untouched by wind or time. "Do you see this?" Marco pointed to a mark on the chest's corner. An ornate symbol, unmistakable to anyone with historical training. This is the seal of the Medici, Florence's greatest family. And here, look at this sequence of letters, Libri Prohibiti, the forbidden books. This was a Medici commission, Elena. Someone from the Medici family commissioned this chamber and this chest. That means resources, power, protection. That means whatever is inside mattered enough to risk papal censure. Elena felt the weight of centuries settle on her shoulders like accumulated dust. Aunt Em, she knew. She came here, and she left the map for us to find. But why? Why not just tell us directly? Because she was protecting us, Marco said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice. Or protecting herself. Or protecting whatever is inside that chest. Information like this, it's dangerous, Elena. In the wrong hands or released at the wrong time, it could hurt people. That answer would have to wait, because as they stood before the chest, neither of them noticed the sound, faint but distinct, of someone else descending the stone stairs. Chapter 3. The Hidden Observer. The footsteps ceased. Whoever had entered the tunnel had stopped, perhaps sensing their presence through some vibration in the stone. Elena and Marco exchanged a glance, a wordless agreement to remain silent. Marco switched off his headlamp. In the darkness, they waited. Minutes passed like hours. Elena's heart hammered in her chest. She could hear Marco breathing beside her, shallow and controlled. The darkness was absolute, the kind of darkness that existed only deep underground, untouched by any light source. Then a new light appeared at the tunnel's entrance, not an electric lamp, but something older, more unstable, a torch, burning with the uncertain flicker of flame, casting dancing shadows that distorted perspective. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the firelight. The person was lean, dressed in dark clothing, moving with the confidence of someone who had walked this tunnel before. Their footsteps were sure, measured, carrying no hesitation. As they entered the chamber, the light revealed a woman in her 60s, grey-haired and stern-faced, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and command. She carried not just the torch, but a leather satchel, worn with use but carefully maintained. She stopped when she saw Elena and Marco, surprise flickering across her features for just a moment before being carefully suppressed. "I had hoped it would take you longer to find this place," she said. Her voice was steady, cultured, with an accent unmistakably Roman, someone who had spent her life in the city. "I thought perhaps another decade before the map surfaced, but Margarita was always impatient with waiting." Marco stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Elena. "Who are you? How do you know our aunt?" "My name is Vittoria Rosselli. I'm a member of the Società della Verità, the Society of Truth. We have protected this chamber for nearly 70 years. I have protected it personally for 36 of those years." She gestured toward the stone chest with a gesture that was almost sad. "Your aunt was also a member, though she chose a different path than ours. She believed the world was ready to know what lies inside." "And you?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "What do you believe?" Vittoria smiled, an expression more complex than mere happiness or sadness. It held resignation, determination, and something that might have been relief. "I believe your aunt was right. I have believed that for some years now. But the society does not always listen to individual voices, no matter how experienced. The society prefers to maintain the old protocols, the old secrecy." "What does it contain?" Elena asked, moving toward the chest. Vittoria stepped aside, making no move to stop her. "A codex, written by hand in 1534 by Cardinal Girolamo Mercurial, before his death came rather suddenly, and not from natural causes, though the official records call it a fever." She paused, allowing the weight of that statement to settle. "It contains observations about the early texts of the Bible, variations, contradictions, evidence that the scriptures were composed and edited by human hands across centuries. Not by angels, not by divine inspiration exactly, but by scholars and priests and monks working to preserve and interpret sacred texts. At the time, to suggest such things was to invite the Inquisition's attention. To suggest it was to be marked for death." She walked to the chest and ran her fingers across the inscriptions with evident familiarity. "The Church ordered it sealed. The Medici family, who had commissioned Mercurial's research, moved it here, to this convent where their influence could protect it. We made certain it remained hidden, protected for hundreds of years. But your aunt began to question whether protection through secrecy was ethical. She began to believe that knowledge should not be imprisoned, no matter how threatening it seemed." "Then publish it," Marco said suddenly. "If the Codex exists, if it's genuine, it should be studied. The world has changed since 1534. Biblical scholarship is established. Universities openly discuss the composition of Scripture. This shouldn't be controversial." "Shouldn't be," Vittoria echoed with a sad laugh. "But will be. Everything is controversial to those who believe their faith depends on literal truth. Everything is dangerous to those who profit from certainty." She paused. "Your aunt understood this. That's why she left the map for you. Not for the society. She wanted you to decide what to do with the knowledge, not institutions, not hierarchies. You." Marco reached for the chest. Vittoria did not stop him. Chapter 4. The Codex. The stone chest was lighter than it appeared, worn into a rounded smoothness by time and countless handlings. Marco's fingers found grooves carved into the lid, not a lock, but a mechanism, a puzzle in stone. He worked it slowly, feeling for the correct sequence, imagining the minds that had created it centuries ago. He could almost feel their hands guiding his fingers through the solution. The lid shifted with a grinding sound, the first noise the chest had made in decades. Dust, undisturbed for generations, rose into the air in a pale cloud that caught their headlamp beams like smoke. It settled slowly, coating their clothes, their skin. Inside, wrapped in silk that had gone grey with age and exposure, lay a single book. The binding was leather, cracked with time but still holding, tooled with Latin text and the same symbols that covered the chest. The title was barely legible: Veritas Scriptorum, the truth of scriptures. Marco lifted it carefully, reverently, as if it might crumble at any moment. The weight of it surprised him, not heavy, but significant, substantial, a real thing, not a legend. The silk wrappings fell away as he moved, fragments of fabric that had lost their structural integrity years ago. He opened it to a random page. The handwriting was small, precise, written in sepia ink that had faded but remained legible across the centuries. Latin. Theological discourse intermingled with historical analysis, with annotations in margins suggesting dialogue. Mercurial arguing with himself, questioning the assumptions of his own faith. There were diagrams too, showing variations in manuscripts, parallels between different versions of gospel passages. Evidence of editorial hands at work. "This is extraordinary," Marco whispered, his voice trembling. If this is authentic, this predates modern textual criticism by centuries. This man was doing the work of a scholar in an age when such work meant death. He was applying logic to scripture. He was treating the Bible like any other historical document. He turned the pages carefully, each movement deliberate. Some sections were heavily annotated, with dozens of margin notes cramped into every available space. Other sections were left blank, as if Mercurial had run out of words or courage at crucial points. "It is authentic," Vittoria said quietly, watching his reaction. "I have seen it examined by conservators, by scholars working in secret. We have verified the paper, the binding, the ink composition. Everything confirms its authenticity, and it cost Mercurial his life. The church knew he had written it. They did not execute him openly, but they made certain he was removed from the world. His papers were destroyed. His name was erased from the historical record in most of Europe. The Codex was the only part that survived, hidden by monks who believed the truth eventually should be preserved for the future." Elena reached out and touched a page carefully, her fingers barely grazing the surface. The paper was soft, almost papery with age, fragile in a way that demanded reverence. Why did Aunt Em leave the map? Why didn't she simply contact the society? Why not tell us directly what this was? "Because your aunt was sick," Vittoria said. "The cancer had progressed further than she admitted to many people. She knew she had perhaps 6 months, possibly less. She also knew that if she simply told you verbally, you might not believe her, or might doubt your own judgment. But if you discovered it yourselves, if you found the map and solved the puzzle, then you would know beyond doubt. You would be invested in the truth." She paused. "And because your aunt believed the church's authority to conceal knowledge was ending, she believed the world had changed. She understood that believers could accommodate complexity, could accept that humans had shaped Scripture without that fact diminishing Scripture's moral power. She was right." Marco looked up from the book. "This should be in a museum. It should be studied, published, discussed by scholars. The world deserves to know this exists. The world needs to know that faith survived the discovery that Scripture was written by humans." "The world," Vittoria said quietly, "is not always prepared for what it thinks it deserves. But you are right. The time has come." A distant sound interrupted them. A grinding noise, deep and resonant, as if stone was shifting somewhere in the convent above. Subtle at first, barely noticeable, but growing more pronounced. Elena felt it as much as heard it, a vibration through the floor, travelling up her spine. Chapter 5. The Risk. The grinding intensified, no longer subtle, but undeniable. Dust fell from the chamber's ceiling in slow spirals, catching light like descending snow. Marco grabbed the Codex, cradling it against his chest as Elena stumbled backward toward the tunnel entrance. Her mind was racing through calculations. How stable was the chamber? How much weight did the ceiling support? What were the odds of catastrophic collapse? "What's happening?" Elena shouted over the growing noise. Vittoria's face had gone pale, her composure finally cracking. "The convent is settling. The structure above, it's been weakened by moisture for years, by centuries of seepage and freeze-thaw cycles. The seal that protects this chamber, it's connected to the foundations through a network of engineered support systems. If they fail..." Another rumble. Louder than the first, more violent. A section of the ceiling cracked with a sound like a gunshot, a fissure spreading across the stone like lightning. Plaster dust fell in sheets, small rocks fell, then larger pieces, some the size of fists. The chamber was collapsing, returning to disorder after 500 years of perfect preservation. Elena could see it happening in slow motion, the careful engineering of centuries unraveling, the Medici engineers' calculations proving insufficient against the march of time. "Run!" she shouted. "We have to get out!" Marco moved toward the tunnel, but Vittoria did not move. She stood before the open chest, reaching down and removing something from her satchel. A leather-bound journal, worn with handling, filled with notes in her own handwriting. Decades of observations, Elena realized. Decades of guardianship recorded on these pages. "Vittoria, we have to leave!" Elena reached for her, but the older woman stepped toward the falling debris, toward danger. She held the journal close to her chest. "Go," she commanded, and her voice held such authority that both Elena and Marco froze for a moment. "Take the Codex. Get it to the university, to Professor Dante Rossi at the Vatican Archives. He'll know what to do. He's been waiting for this moment for years." "We're not leaving you." Marco moved toward her, but another section of ceiling collapsed between them. A massive block of stone that crashed to the floor where he would have stood, cutting off his path to Vittoria. Dust erupted in a choking cloud. "Yes, you are," Vittoria said calmly, even as the chamber came down around her. "This is not your place. This is mine. I've been here since 1989, in spirit, if not in body. I gave my life to protecting this codex. I can give my death to ensuring it reaches the world." "We're not leaving you!" Elena moved forward, but Marco grabbed her, pulling her toward the tunnel even as she struggled. The dust was suffocating now, filling the air, coating their lungs. The noise was deafening, a roar of stone returning to earth. Elena caught one last glimpse of Vittoria, standing calm amid the chaos, holding the journal, accepting what was coming. Then the tunnel opened before them, and they ran. The stairs were becoming slick with water, groundwater suddenly liberated by the collapse, seeping through cracks in the walls that had suddenly opened. The stone's integrity was compromised, releasing decades of pent-up moisture. Marco slipped once on a step, caught himself against the wall, kept moving. Elena's lungs burned with dust and exertion. Above them, the convent's weight was crushing the passage behind them, closing it off stone by stone, swallowing the chamber and everything in it. The stairs seemed endless, stretching upward into infinity. But gradually, the air grew fresher, less thick with dust. Their headlamps caught glimpses of the upper passage, then the sealed storage room. They emerged into daylight as the final collapse occurred behind them. The stone chest's chamber ceased to exist, entombed once more, but this time beneath rubble and collapse. The tunnel was gone, destroyed completely, the way back sealed forever. The convent groaned above them, settling into its new configuration, stone finding new equilibrium after 500 years. Chapter 6. The Consequence. They did not call for help immediately. They sat in the courtyard as the sun climbed higher, coughing dust, while Marco held the Codex, as if it might dissolve like a dream. Elena's hands shook as she brushed debris from her hair. Her mind kept returning to Vittoria's face in that final moment, the quiet acceptance in her eyes, the calm with which she had faced the end. "She sacrificed herself," Elena said finally, her voice hollow. "She chose," Marco corrected, but his voice was equally hollow. "She made a conscious decision. That's not sacrifice in the traditional sense. That's sacrifice in the heroic sense. That's choosing to give your life for something larger than yourself." "She knew," Elena said, understanding settling into her bones. "She knew this was going to happen. She came down here expecting the collapse." "Yes," Marco said, "she did. She was ready to die for this codex. She had probably been ready for years." They did call eventually as required by law and reason. The authorities came. Fire department, structural engineers, police. They surveyed the convent, and the engineers' reports were grim. The east wing had experienced structural failure. The collapse appeared to have been triggered by water damage and stress fractures in the supporting columns. The convent would need to be sealed off. Further investigation might be needed, but it was clear that the damage was extensive and potentially dangerous. But before the sealing happened, before the official inspections made access impossible, Marco made copies of every page of the Codex. He photographed them with meticulous care, creating digital backups, storing files in encrypted cloud services that no single government could access. He sent encrypted files to an email address Vittoria had mentioned during their conversation, Professor Dante Rossi at the Vatican Archives. The email, carefully composed over several hours, contained only a message and a digital image of the first page. "She sent me to you. She said you had been waiting." Marco. 3 days later, a response arrived. Rossi wanted to meet. He wanted to examine the Codex in person. He wanted to understand how Vittoria had died, what had happened in the chamber, what the future looked like now. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Chapter 7. The Revelation. Professor Dante Rossi was younger than they expected, perhaps 50, with the precise manner of a man who had spent his life cataloguing artifacts and parsing textual minutiae. His office in the Vatican Archives was lined with books, with manuscripts in protective cases, with the accumulated knowledge of centuries carefully preserved and organized. He met them in a small, secure research room deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica, after hours, after the usual visitors had departed and security had been notified to expect them. His reaction to the Codex was immediate and visceral. He opened it slowly, reverently, with the care of someone handling something sacred. He read several passages, cross-referencing them with notes in a leather-bound journal he kept beside him. Then he closed it gently and looked up from the book. When he looked up, his eyes were glistening with tears he did not bother to conceal. "This is genuine," he said. His voice was steady despite the emotion. "I need to verify the ink, the paper, the binding through proper conservation procedures. But I have no doubt. This is Mercurial's work. This is... Do you understand what you have? This is a 400-year-old manuscript that predates the Enlightenment by 200 years, written by a man of faith questioning his own faith. This isn't an attack on religion. This is a monk's desperate attempt to reconcile truth with belief, written in the years just before the Council of Trent. This is evidence that the debate about textual authority has been ongoing for centuries. "Will the Church try to suppress it?" Elena asked. Rossi smiled, a sad, knowing expression that carried the weight of decades working within institutional structures. "The Church I serve now is not the Church of 1534. We have published scholarly works questioning the origins of Scripture. We have admitted publicly that the textual transmission is complex, that human hands shaped the canon. We have acknowledged that believers can accommodate this knowledge without losing faith." He paused, considering. "But publishing Mercurial's Codex will still generate controversy. It will be misinterpreted, weaponized by those who wish to argue that faith is impossible if Scripture is human-made. It will be seized upon by cynics and those seeking ammunition for arguments they've already decided to make." "Then publish it anyway," Marco said firmly. "That's what Aunt Em wanted. That's what Vittoria died to preserve. Isn't the truth worth the controversy it generates?" Vittoria. Rossi's expression changed, transformed by something that looked like grief. "What happened to Vittoria? Please, tell me everything." They told him. The tunnel collapse, the chamber being sealed, the choice she made to remain behind so they could escape with the Codex. Rossi listened in complete silence, his hands folded on the desk before him. his face showing the kind of pain that only comes from losing someone you loved. When they finished, he stood and walked to the window, looking out over the Vatican's dark gardens, past the walls that enclosed this ancient institution. For a long moment he did not speak. When he turned back to face them, his eyes were clear again, dry but haunted. "She was a good woman," he said finally, "a principled woman. She served the Society of Truth for 30 years, and she served it with her whole heart. But she also knew when the Society's time had passed. She knew that the age of secrets was ending. She wanted the Codex published, released into the world. She told me so years ago, in a private conversation. She said, 'The world is ready, Dante. The world has been ready for decades. We just lack the courage to let it go.'" He returned to his desk. She was waiting for this moment. She was waiting for someone to find the map, to discover the chamber, to bring the Codex out into the light. Over the next weeks, Rossi began the careful process of verification and publication. He brought in conservation experts, paleographers, historians of the early church. Each one confirmed the Codex's authenticity. Mercurial's handwriting was verified through comparison with authenticated letters held in archives across Italy. The ink composition was analyzed and dated to the 1530s. The binding was examined, its construction confirmed as consistent with Renaissance techniques. The Codex was genuine. Beyond any doubt, it was genuine. Rossi began working with academic publishers, crafting the presentation carefully. The Codex would be released under the prestigious university press, accompanied by scholarly commentary, historical context, and full translation into modern languages. It would be presented not as a threat to faith, but as evidence of faith's evolution, of believers wrestling with truth across centuries, of scholars working to understand and preserve sacred texts despite institutional pressure. He invited Elena and Marco to the planning meetings. He wanted them involved in the process, wanted them to understand the complexity of what was happening. They were the custodians now, he told them. The burden of this knowledge now rested on their shoulders as much as his. Chapter 8. The History Within. The academic response was swift and overwhelming. Within months, universities were requesting copies of the Codex. Theological departments began teaching Mercurial's text alongside other primary sources from the Renaissance. Bible scholars lined up to contribute to the published edition, each one adding their expertise to the interpretation. The controversy, such as it was, remained largely academic. Faith proved more resilient than the fearful had always insisted. Yes, some conservative religious communities rejected the Codex's implications. Yes, some argued that Mercurial had been wrong in his conclusions. But the mainstream academic community received it as a significant historical document, a testament to the long history of scholarly engagement with Scripture. Rossi organized a symposium at the Vatican, inviting scholars from around the world. Historians of textual criticism discussed Mercurial's methods and contributions. Theologians debated how his observations might be integrated into modern Christian understanding. The event was covered by international media, treated as a major scholarly moment. But what moved Elena most, what stayed with her long after the academic fervor had settled, was what they discovered in Vittoria's final act. Among the papers that emerged from beneath the collapsed convent, recovered carefully by archaeologists who excavated the destruction over several weeks, was her journal. It lay protected within a stone niche, somehow preserved in the collapse, somehow spared from the worst of the damage. The journal was worn, its leather cover cracked and water-damaged, but the pages inside were largely intact. Vittoria's handwriting covered nearly every page, dated entries spanning decades, a complete record of her guardianship. In its pages, Vittoria had documented not just the Codex, but her own spiritual journey. She had been raised Catholic, had nearly become a nun herself, then had encountered the Society of Truth in 1989 and experienced her own crisis of conscience. She had learned about the Codex, about Mercurial's careful scholarship, and she had begun to question the institution she served. She had preserved the Codex not from a desire to keep truth hidden, but from a fear that releasing it too soon to an unprepared world would cause harm. She had agonized over this decision in her journal, page after page of internal debate, wrestling with the ethics of her own guardianship. But she had changed her mind over the decades. Time had changed her. The world had changed her. She wrote in an entry from 2020, "I think I have been wrong. I came to the society believing that truth needed protection, that humanity was not ready to know how Scripture came to be. But I have lived long enough to see that people are more resilient than I believed. Faith does not depend on the literal truth of every word. Faith depends on meaning, on relationship with the divine, on the moral teachings that emerge from sacred texts. The Codex cannot destroy faith. It can only mature it if given the chance. I am an old woman now, and I am tired of carrying this secret. Perhaps it is time to let it go. Perhaps the young woman who emerges from the tunnel with the Codex should decide what to do with it, not an old woman guarding it from the past." In another entry, dated just months before her death, "I have decided. When they come, and they will come, I am certain of it. I will let them have the Codex. I will help them retrieve it. And if the chamber comes down, as the engineers have warned me it will, then I will let it come down. Some treasures are too heavy to carry alone. Some truths are meant to be shared, even at cost." She had known. Elena understood reading these words. Vittoria had known the tunnel was unstable, had known that accessing the chamber again would trigger collapse. She had left clues for Elena and Marco, had guided them to discovery, and then had made sure that when they found what they sought, she could ensure they escaped with their prize. Chapter 9. The True Treasure. The convent of Santa Margherita was carefully restored, not as a religious space, but as a historical archive and museum. The destroyed east wing was excavated carefully, and the tunnel's collapse was documented in meticulous detail. It became a testament to time, to stone returning to earth, to the price paid for knowledge preserved and finally released. The stone chest, miraculously preserved beneath the rubble in a protected chamber formed by chance, or perhaps by the design of the original engineers, who had anticipated this possibility, was carefully removed and placed in the Vatican archives alongside the Codex. It became a centerpiece of the Mercurial exhibit, the physical evidence of centuries of preservation. Historians studied the symbols carved into its surface, and slowly their meanings emerged. A map, in a sense, a timeline of human understanding rendered in stone. Each symbol represented a scholar who had guarded the chamber, each one dated, each one bearing witness to the fact that truth had mattered to them enough to dedicate their lives to its preservation. Elena and Marco established a foundation in their aunt's name and in Vittoria's, dedicated to preserving manuscripts at risk of being hidden or destroyed. They worked with universities, with the church, with private collectors and government archives. They found other documents that had been locked away, other truths waiting for the right moment to be released into the world. The money that might have come from selling the convent? It never materialized. The property was given to the church to maintain as a museum, to preserve both the building and the memory of what had happened within it. Neither Elena nor Marco cared about profit. They had inherited something far more valuable. The knowledge that their aunt and a stranger named Vittoria had believed in something worth sacrificing for. Not gold, not material wealth, not the kinds of treasures that could be counted or divided. The true treasure was the burden of truth and the freedom that comes with finally sharing it. Years later, Elena would stand in the Vatican archives in a climate-controlled chamber and hold a digital copy of Mercuriali's Codex on a computer screen. She could read his words, his doubts, his faith, his determination to reconcile the two. His careful scholarship pursued in secret, in fear. She would think of how those words, preserved through centuries of secrecy, had finally emerged into the light. And she would think of Vittoria, who had guarded these pages, who had waited for the right person to come seeking them, who had chosen death to ensure their freedom. Vittoria's gravestone, placed in the restored convent cemetery where other guardians lay, bore only a single inscription, Veritas in Abysso. She brought it to light. Elena and Marco would visit the grave each year on the anniversary of its dedication. They would bring flowers, always white ones, for purity, for clarity. They would stand in silence, honoring the woman who had trusted them with history's secrets. The world was always ready for truth, Elena understood finally. It was merely a question of trust and of having the courage to believe that truth, once released, would find its own place in human understanding. That knowledge would not destroy, but transform. That faith could survive the discovery that humans, imperfect and curious humans, had shaped Scripture across centuries. The greatest treasure was not the Codex itself, though it was precious. The greatest treasure was knowing that two women, their aunt and Vittoria, had believed this so deeply that they had dedicated their lives to ensuring it would be known. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.